I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we look at recent border trouble up in the Baltics, discuss the impact of Joe Biden's decision to let Ukraine strike Russian forces inside Russia. We analyse the Kremlin's recent geopolitical moves in Africa and Central Asia. And we're on the ground in Singapore, where, 2 days ago, President Zelelnksy made a surprise appearance at an Asian security forum.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 4th of June, 2 years and 102 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell, senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant, foreign correspondent James Kilner, and Asia correspondent Nicola Smith. I started by summarising the latest news from Ukraine. Well, let's start in Dnipro, where an overnight Russian strike injured 8 people, including a 1-month-old baby and a 17-year-old boy. This comes from the region's governor, Serhiy Lysak, who added that Ukrainian air defence systems downed 2 missiles over the city. Ukrainian media also reported that debris from the missiles caused damage to civilian infrastructure and shattered windows in local houses. In the south, Russian strikes in the Kherson region killed 1 person and injured 2. A first attack hit the village of Bilozerka in the morning. Alexander Prokudin, this is the regional governor of Kherson, he added that an 81-year-old woman suffered blast injuries and a 55-year-old woman suffered a shrapnel wound to the stomach. Another Russian strike killed an elderly woman in the village of Valentensky at around 12:30 local time, again from the regional governor. The Institute for the Study of War has an interesting piece of news in their daily update. That's the American-based think tank. They write that Ukrainian forces likely struck a Russian S-300/400 air defense battery in Belgorod Oblast. The ISW says this was likely destroyed with HIMARS on June the 1st or 2nd. Geolocated imagery published on June the 3rd shows 2 destroyed launches and a damaged command post of the air defense system in a field north of Belgorod city. This is something that we'll have Roland and James commenting on later. Russian sources widely speculated, and that was still with the ISW here, that Ukrainian forces used US-provided HIMARS, but Ukrainian officials have yet to comment on the strike. As we said, Roland will touch on this, but the ISW finished this update by noting that Russian sources have increasingly claimed that Ukrainian forces are using HIMARS to strike Belgorod since the US partially lifted its restrictions on Ukraine's ability to use US-provided weapons to strike military targets in Russian border areas. They also note, quote, Russian sources will likely continue to characterize any successful strike in Belgorod as a HIMARS strike, regardless of the system used. And as I said, this is something we will get into later. Away from the battlefield, important for us to note that power cuts are expected throughout Ukraine all day as Russia continues striking energy infrastructure. This comes from the Ukrainian grid operator, Ukrenergo, who reported this morning. Friend of the podcast, French journalist Fabrice Desprez, has been covering this, so do follow his Twitter account for more details on that. Just some other updates before we go to James Rothwell. Reuters is reporting that Gazprom, Russia's majority state-owned energy giant, actually increased the average daily amount of natural gas supplied to Europe via pipeline by 39% in the year to May. The calculations, based on data from ENTSOG and Gazprom's own reports, also showed that supplies delivered to Europe in May rose by 7.3% from April. Remember that despite the war, Russia continues to transport gas to Europe via Ukraine, with Moscow paying Kyiv transit fees. In 2023, these fees amounted to $800 million, that's around £630 million, which equates to 0.446% of Ukrainian GDP. This is according to the Centre for European Policy Analysis. We only have time today for a short update on this, but it's certainly a topic I think we should return to in the future. Moving away then, looking at the upcoming Swiss peace talks on the war, the White House has talked up the potential impact China could have. Matthew Miller, a US State Department spokesman, said in a press briefing, quote, "We have always been clear that China could play a useful diplomatic role in helping resolve this conflict if it wanted to." He added that Beijing's cooperation with Russia would hinder its ability to assist in ending the conflict. Quote, "Right now, it's hard to see how they could play that role, given the actions that we've seen China take over recent months to reconstitute Russia's defense industrial base." To remind ourselves, China was invited to the Swiss peace talks, which are scheduled for mid-June, but said last week it would not attend without participation from Russia. Going to Russia then, the Kremlin has said that these talks on peace are absurd without Moscow's participation. Quote, resolving the Ukrainian issue is impossible without Russia. There are fewer and fewer participants coming to the conference on the crisis in Switzerland. This is from Vyacheslav Volodin, the Russian State Duma speaker, who was writing on Telegram. Finally, responding to reports that France could send instructors to Ukraine to train the country's armed forces, Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, has said, quote, any instructors who train Ukrainian troops have no immunity, whether they are French or not. To remind ourselves finally, last month Ukraine said it was in ongoing talks with France about sending military instructors to Ukraine. In March, a German military leak revealed that British troops were on the ground in Ukraine, helping Kiev's forces fire long-range Storm Shadow missiles, and the government later confirmed the presence of, quote, a small number of personnel in Ukraine. Well, those are the updates from Ukraine and from the front. James Rothwell, can I come to you first, just for a couple of updates from Germany before we get into your and Roland's big piece on Baltic and Scandinavian defences?
There is quite a lot of discussion in Germany at the moment about the news, which caused a bit of a splash over here, actually, that German weapons who have been provided to Ukraine can now be used on attacks that are directly attacking Russian territory. So there's a bit of a debate over here about the extent to which that's actually going to be useful in this conflict. For example, quite a few people have pointed out the fact that the majority of the weapons that Germany has provided are not really relevant to, for example, carrying out strikes deep inside Russian territory or indeed over the front line. My understanding, for example, is that the howitzers that Germany has provided, they're not even stationed near the Russian border, so they wouldn't be actually sort of relevant to a strike, for example, in Belgorod. So there's a little bit of skepticism, not cynicism, I would say, but skepticism about the extent to which it will have a sort of kind of practical impact on the Ukrainian war effort.
Thank you very much for that, James. Let's then zoom out slightly. You and Roland have written this rather big piece on essentially Russia probing the Baltic states' defences. Why did you decide to look at this, and what did you find?
Yeah, so this was a really, really interesting story that Roland and I worked on, which is about Vladimir Putin beginning to, as it were, probe the defences of the Baltic regions. Now, this all started roughly 2 weeks ago when there were two border incidents over in that part of the world. Some buoys floating in a river, that's sea buoys, not actual buoys, were removed from the Russian side of the border with Estonia, which looked like an attempt to perhaps slightly redraw the maps between Russia and Estonia, which caused a lot of concern. And then the Russian government also published a sort of communique which suggested they wanted to remap their borders around the Gulf of Finland too. Now, it's worth stressing that Russia has been playing with these borders for a long time, but in the context of the war in Ukraine and a lot of imperialist rhetoric that we've seen coming from Putin particularly, there is real concern that not just some kind of provocation might be on the cards over in the Baltic states, but potentially a military incursion and even some attempted land grabs. Now, I should stress that no one that I've spoken to thinks this is going to happen in the near future. They point out that Putin's forces are completely tied up at the moment fighting in Ukraine. We are talking, however, about this potentially becoming a major security crisis somewhere in the region of 3 to 5 years after perhaps the war in Ukraine has died down, regardless of what the outcome might be, and after Putin has finished this sort of long-term goal of building up his forces and getting them ready for, as I said, some kind of land grab. Now, Roland and I interviewed the ambassador of Estonia in the UK and the Finnish ambassador, who's posted here in Berlin. And they were pretty united, really, on what they think is going on. They see this as a long-term attempt to sort of prod and probe at these borders and to find potentially some weak spots. Now, a big question is, why would Putin want to do this? And I think the answer lies in a lot of Putin's own rhetoric about this. We know that this has moved way beyond, for Putin now, the context of perceiving NATO as a threat or anything like that. And his mind seems to be, I don't know if Roland would agree with this completely, but it seems to be fixed on this sort of neo-imperialist idea of becoming, in his eyes, great man of history, retaking parts of Europe that he thinks belongs to him. And when he reaches the end of his life, which who knows could be quite soon, this is all about his legacy. And it's always about now, I think, the state that Putin leaves Russia in, rather than the state it's in when he got into power. And of course, you could argue that the only way he's going to stay in power is to have sort of perpetual warfare. And of course, One way to extend that war would be to casting his gaze Sauron-like, if you will, over the Baltic region.
Roland, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, that pretty much covers it. I mean, the context, obviously, in the Baltics is that they are they hate this term, but it's what they are, former Soviet republics. There's a lot of history there, but they're the only parts of the former Soviet Union, both inside the European Union and inside NATO. And since they've always had nerves about what they've seen as, potential revanchist Russian ambitions. I mean, going back kind of decades, right? And one of the long-running sore spots between the Baltic states and Russia is, of course, the Russian minority. Most of them moved to the area after the Second World War, when Stalin annexed those countries. There was a massive cyber attack on Estonia back, I think, in 2007, which is, often referred to as one of the first acts of, cyber warfare in the modern era of cyber warfare. So all this doesn't really come out of nowhere. It's a long-running headache for those countries. Of course, with the Ukraine war, they've begun to feel like, Western countries have begun to take them seriously. It's interesting how far they're prepared to push it. They are under the NATO umbrella. Most people you speak to, I mean, including the Estonian ambassador I spoke to in London, will say, and I don't think that Putin really wants to risk getting into a war with NATO and so on. And yet he wants to push, he wants to see what he can do and so on, just to see how much he can get away with. And the theory is that, the great big, the scenario everyone's terrified of is that, if NATO doesn't show enough kind of, backbone in responding to this kind of thing, and if he thinks that actually that suggests that NATO doesn't really have the backbone to put its money where its mouth is, where push comes to shove, that he might try something, a la Crimea, a la Donbass 2014, little green men, deniable kind of local protests or something like that, something to kind of challenge the territorial integrity of those countries. Because the real big prize for Putin is, they talk about a different model or different European security architecture, getting rid of NATO. If you could demonstrate that actually NATO's Article 5 isn't really worth the paper it's written on, then that is a massive prize. And if he thinks that maybe actually he could get away with that, then he might be tempted into action. We're probably a long way from that right now, but that's the theory underlying all of these anxieties. Specifically on the buoys and the Narva River, there is a town called Narva in northeastern Estonia. There is a river that runs, Narva's on one side, there's a place called Ivangorod on the other. That border marks the border between Estonia and Russia. Now, like many former Soviet states, many former Soviet borders, it hasn't been officially demarcated. There's a de facto border, but no one's actually ever got round to going down the river and saying right, 152.6 yards this way, that's yours, and this is ours, and so on. That takes ages, and lots of countries haven't got around to doing that. But the Russians have always had these buoys in the river that are meant to help navigation, to stop fishermen from, wandering to one country or the other. They disappeared overnight. The Estonians say the Russians had never done anything like that before. And they didn't get an explanation. And they put it down to it's another part of these funny little surprising things they think the Russians try to do to kind of see how far they can get, to shake things up. And the way the Estonian ambassador put it to me was look, the problem is we never know what they're going to do next. They're probably thinking about some other funny little thing to do. We weren't really expecting that because they've never done that before, but it is the kind of thing that we think about. Narva, of course, also has a very large Russian-speaking population, so there's always been a kind of headache. Could the Russians do there what they did in Donbass or something, like AstroTurf, an independence movement, and so on? There doesn't seem too much sign of that, but that's another kind of headachy kind of worry. And just to very zoom out in very broad terms, if we're talking about that nightmare scenario of war in the Baltic, the other thing that happened was a Swedish general actually saying, look, Vladimir Putin's got both eyes on Gotland, which is a small island that belongs to Sweden in the eastern part of the Baltic Sea. And the armchair general arrows on a map theory is that in the nightmare event of a Russian attack on the Baltics, the first thing to do would be to take Gotland, put air defense units on it to deny NATO the possibility of resupplying the Baltic states by air. So that's that's the context.
Just one more question from me then, Roland and James, before we move on. What did you get much of a sense of what the representatives from the Baltic states and Finland wanted their Western allies to actually do about this? I mean, they're raising awareness, obviously, by talking to you, but in terms of practical steps, what did they want?
The impression I got from speaking to Kai Sauer, the Finnish ambassador in Berlin, who's speaking to us on the record, is that they are concerned about this, but they don't want to cause a panic. And actually, the Finnish government, in a more sort of official comment on this episode, said that they are monitoring the situation, but they're not overly concerned about it at this stage. And I think it speaks to what Roland said earlier, the very unpredictable nature of this and the possibility that Russia is trying to keep everyone guessing. For example, the removal of the boys from the River Narva was indeed something that had never been done before. And that's concerning, but it also hints at Russia trying to move a little bit asymmetrically and do some things that are a bit unexpected to keep everybody on their toes. So I think the message from the Finnish side, at least, is that they're concerned about this and they're monitoring it, but they're not panicking. And of course, the Finns never really panic about anything. So perhaps that's part of this as well.
Thank you, James. Anything further to add on that, Roland?
Yeah, I mean, similar kind of message from these are senior diplomats we've been speaking on the record, so they're very much giving us what they want us to hear and the official line. But yeah, I think a similar kind of thing from the Estonians, kind of, we are concerned. He had to kind of balance it, 'cause at one point I'm saying, you're saying it's not quite a big deal. He goes, no, it's very provocative, etc., but we're not panicking. We don't want to, be too alarmed about it. The Estonian ambassador, he said the timing wasn't that surprising in the sense that a lot of what Russia is focused on is kind of influencing elections and things. He said, there's European Union parliamentary elections coming up, and part of the Estonians' assessment of the Russian game plan is to shake things up, to alarm people, to kind of give reasons to be a bit edgy, to question solidarity, especially ultimately with Ukraine. And he put it very much in the context of the war with Ukraine as well. He said, ultimately, what do they want? They want to undermine the political, social consensus on supporting Ukraine. And he was very much flagging, there are elections coming up in Europe. That's probably got a lot to do with what's happened this time.
Well, thank you very much, James and Roland, for bringing us that. Roland, can I stay with you? On Friday, you published a fascinating article, of course, in reaction to the news that US President Joe Biden has authorized cross-border attacks from Ukraine into Russia with American weapons. You looked at where and what the Ukrainians might hit. So take us through that. What were you looking at, and what would you want us to know?
Yeah, I mean, the context, just to understand, because it helps explain what we wrote, really. We kind of saw this coming before Biden made the announcement. So we're already working on a piece about, where could things strike? What difference would it make if Ukraine is, for want of a better term, let off the leash and allowed to fire Western-supplied weapons into Russia? Because before Joe Biden finally made that announcement, dozens and dozens of other European countries had also said, we will let you do this. So we're working on that. And then the Americans came out and said, okay, you can do it as well. There is a very heavy caveat on that American support, which we'll get to in a second. But the basic answer is this: Ukraine's a lot of Ukraine's success, or Ukraine's kind of tactical doctrine in the war, has been using kind of deeper strikes behind the front line to disrupt logistics, command nodes, high-value targets in the Russian rear, in order to kind of degrade their ability to maintain offensives or to kind of slow down their offensives. Also to kind of hit concentrations of troops and things like that. And for the first 2.5 years of the war, if you exclude the first month of the invasion, basically all of the Russian attacks have been generated on, launched from occupied Ukrainian territory. So this restriction on firing into Russia didn't really make a difference. Then comes along, you get the new Russian attack into Kharkiv region, which began it's last month now, right? We're already in June. So on May 10th, that began, and immediately you've got a problem because the HIMARS launches, the Western artillery, all these things that the Ukrainians had used to kind of disrupt Russian operations or offensive operations or to preempt those operations in occupied Ukraine just couldn't be used. So you had, Ukrainian soldiers saying, look, we know where they are. We could see them forming up for this attack just a few miles away across the border, but we couldn't fire at them. We would have HIMARS'd them, but we couldn't. Very frustrated. The result is this big campaign, lots of European governments finally saying, you can use our stuff. But the real big thing is the Americans. And the reason it's big is because it's really the Americans they supply three things that are really crucial here. The first is the HIMARS, which first appeared on the battlefield in 2022, long range of about 50 miles, precision strike. That really made an impact when it appeared on the battlefield in 2022 and helped turn the tide in the Ukrainians' favor. But Britain and several other countries have supplied vehicles that launch these rockets, but the Gimler's rockets are American technology. The Americans get to say where they're fired, so that's important. The other thing is the ATACMS, the really big long-range ones, which is a 300-kilometer range. That's American technology. And then air defenses, right? So Patriot missile systems, again, that's American technology. Even if Germany supplied it to you, the ammunition is made in America, as far as I know. But maybe there's someone who knows. Maybe there's a factory somewhere in Europe. Anyway, bottom line is, if you want to use Patriots to shoot down stuff over Russia, which actually the Ukrainians have done a couple of times before, you need American permission. So that was the real big one. So anyway, back to what you're saying, where. The short answer is very simple. It's in those rear areas in Kharkiv region that are supporting and generating this offensive. So in that immediate kind of 20-mile area of countryside south of Belgorod to the border is about halfway between Belgorod and Kharkiv. That area, there's a concentration of troops that was spotted a little bit further left. There's a place called Graivoron. If you go over on the border with Sumy region, where Russians were seen concentrating, there was some talk about whether they might try and launch a new offensive into Sumy, so I kind of suspect that they might hit that. And then you've got these air bases around the place, and there's a number of air bases. The one that really stands out, actually, there's within 300k, you could hit this air base at Voronezh, which is meant to be home to an Su-34 squadron, which is pretty important with the glide bomb stuff. So these are all the things they would hit. We thought they would hit. That's what we said. Ultimately, the Americans put on such a tight caveat on this that's actually quite constrained. You can see that from what's happened. What the Americans said was, you can fire into Russia, but only in defense of Kharkiv, only to defeat this offensive. So we've seen these HIMARS strikes hitting S-300 launches and things like that in Belgorod region. And the Americans have explicitly said, like the ATACMS, the really long-range stuff, that's off the table. You're not firing that into what we might call, mainland Russia, excluding annexed Crimea, because, America doesn't recognize that as part of Russia. Crimea is fair game, open range. You can't fire much further. So actually, the impact is, for now, fairly limited in that area near the border, and there's reasons for that limitation, which we can get into about deconfliction and so on. But that's pretty much what we're seeing.
Thank you, Roland. That was incredibly comprehensive. And as I was writing my questions, you then sort of proceeded to answer everything I was going to ask before I asked it. Well, let's get into those limitations you mentioned at the end there.
Yeah. So we've got to go back to this whole deconfliction problem, right? And so from the beginning of the war, the Americans, but actually also the Russians, I don't think this is one-sided, very nervous about this turning into a direct Russia on NATO conflict for obvious reasons, which, there's no need to spell out now. And one way of managing that was say, okay, we'll give you weapons to use, defensive weapons, or okay, we'll give you tanks, we'll give you offensive weapons, but you can only use them inside Ukrainian territory. You can't strike Russia. And that annoys the Ukrainians. But it didn't really affect the tactical situation because, for the reasons that I described, like most of the tactical fighting was happening along a front inside occupied Ukrainian territory. So what the Americans have said is you can fire into Russia in order to kind of hold back this Kharkiv offensive, but not before. And that has the effect of, if you see what I mean, it's almost just leveling the playing field, right? So you had this kind of unspoken rule of the game in occupied Ukraine. Russia changed the rules, you could say, by coming across the border again. The White House says, okay, we're changing the rules. But very, very clearly saying we're only changing the rules for that. We're only leveling the playing field. You changed the rules by doing that. We're doing it again. It doesn't really change that much. It makes this battle like the other battles. But what we're not doing, very clearly, what the White House is trying to signal, is we're not escalating. There's this word escalation that goes around a lot. We're not going to allow the Ukrainians to, conduct long-range strikes against your ore refineries with our kit. So that message very clearly delivered by the Americans. And I must say, I think probably the Kremlin get that. I think this saber rattling about that Vladimir Putin and some other Russian officials kind of suggested that this might lead to a nuclear war before it happened. I think that's, massive hyperbole. And I think probably the Kremlin understands that. They probably understand this signal. Right, and it's quite possible even, like the Americans have said it to them, like, if you want us to stop striking across the border, then like withdraw from Kharkiv region, and we go back to the way it was. So you can see this balancing act. I personally don't buy the idea that it's an escalation, because I think it does just kind of, in a way, restore the status quo. It seems to follow the same kind of rules of the game as have been established over the past couple of years of war elsewhere. So the upshot, and sorry to take the sting out of the tail of the entire story, David, therefore, this is unlikely to actually have a dramatic impact, I think, on the course of the war, because really this is a tactical intervention, not a big strategic one.
Well, very quickly, thank you, Roland. Very quickly, before we go to James Kilner, you say that it's unlikely to have much of an impact. Could you just talk a little bit more about that? My assumption would have been that this could, really disrupt Russia's military planning. It would put them on the back foot in areas that they previously thought were safe. And why do you think that it might not change that much?
Because it's because of the Americans have been very clear. This is about the Battle of Kharkiv. Right? It's only about defeating that operation. Right? So it's putting that battle on the same footing as the battles in Donbass, the battles in Zaporizhia, other battles. So the idea is that it is going to make it much more difficult for Russia to prosecute that offensive, to regenerate forces, to get logistics in, with the idea of defeating that local offensive. And perhaps that will, help Ukraine see out the summer, and maybe Ukraine's defensive campaign will be more successful than it may otherwise have been over this summer. Remember, we expect this summer to be one of Ukrainian defense and Russian offense. But that's not the same as saying, okay, we are going to rain down precision strikes on, the airfields deep in Russia, in Volgograd Oblast or something, from where your strategic bombers take off and fire, cruise missiles at long range and stuff like that. That isn't really on the table. So the effect, I think, it kind of turns this battle into another one of the other battles around the front line. I don't see it fundamentally changing other elements of strategic balance. And just on that last one, you'll have seen that Volodymyr Zelelnksy gave an interview to The Guardian over the weekend. And one thing he said to them was he made it pretty clear that when David Cameron said that, Ukraine can fire British Storm Shadow missiles into Russia, no problem, he made it pretty clear that that's not really the case, that there are still some restrictions behind this. So probably even some of the other allies who have said you can use our weapons haven't actually said, you've got, free range fire control, like, fire into Moscow region or anything like that. I think for that reason, basically, David, that is why I think this basically makes the Kharkiv front part of the rest of the front on a similar playing field. But it's not going to be like, we're not going to see American missiles striking the Russian military-industrial complex in the Urals or something like that.
Well, thank you very much, Roland, for all of that. James, let's come to you. You've written quite a few very interesting stories for The Telegraph over the weekend. Let's go inside Russia. You've written up this story that Vladimir Putin plans to impose the largest tax rises on Russians since the 1990s. Maybe just before telling us about these plans, could you just set the scene for us? Because as far as we understand it, this is one of the reasons why, of course, Putin became so popular.
When Putin came into power on New Year's Eve in '99, he inherited this sort of semi-functional or dysfunctional state from Boris Yeltsin, and it was his job to try and impose order. He had lots of problems sorted out, wars in Chechnya, political discontent, all this sort of thing, and another one was also the sort of chaotic tax regime, which was heavily tiered, very leaky, very easy to avoid, etc., etc. So one of his headline policies, which got a lot of global attention at the time, was in 2001 he imposed a 13% flat tax rate, which really sort of brought some order to the problem. He tweaked that 20 years later. He introduced one small extra band, a 15% rate, but essentially it was still referred to as a sort of relatively flat tax rate. This is all going. So the Ministry of Finance, Russian Ministry of Finance, at the end of last week announced a new tax regime in Russia, which was going to incorporate about 4 or 5 bands ranging from 13% to 22%. Now, during his presidential election campaign in March, Putin did say he wanted to change the tax system. He wanted a so-called progressive tax system. And he was pitching himself at the time as a sort of father figure for families across Russia, etc., trying to help people out. But what we have here is a basic raid on Russians to raise an extra £26 billion a year from 2026. That figure will come in about 23 billion from 2025 to pay for his war in Ukraine. He's also given some extra benefits to families with 2 or more children, and he's exempted veterans of his war from this tax rises. So he's also sort of giving sweeteners to his 2 pet projects, which are the war in Ukraine and promoting families and trying to get families to have more children in Russia. But essentially, this all feeds into this total war mentality in Russia, where we know the economy's been completely switched to supporting the war effort. Russia's spending 7% of its GDP on the military now. A third of all government spending is spent on the military, cutting road projects and housing projects, etc. So this is all part of the sort of putting Russia on this war footing that we've written so much about, including changing the Minister of Defence last month for an economist who's going to look at the numbers and look at the bottom line for Putin.
James, before we move on to Russian geopolitics, do we have any sense of how this has gone down in Russia, these new tax bans?
I think generally it's been, Russians have generally accepted that this is going to happen. Most of the tax rises are going to fall on middle class and more wealthy Russians who want to stay on side and who want to be seen to be doing their patriotic duty for Russia, backing Putin in his total war. If you remember, there's no dissent is allowed in Russia. If you step out of line, you basically go to prison. There was a well-documented case before Christmas. All these celebrities, bloggers, TV hosts, etc., held something called a nearly naked party at a nightclub. This really annoyed Putin at a time when his soldiers are battling down in Ukraine, etc. And you had all these celebrities messing around and having a good time in Moscow. That was unacceptable. So again, this is all about getting people into line. This is about imposing his mentality on the Russian people, etc. And they are now going to have to pay for it with higher taxes.
Thank you, James. Let's go. I mean, this is an interesting story. Let's go to Sudan. The Kremlin is playing geopolitics in Africa. What's happening and what do they want? And what are they getting?
So there's a lot going on in Africa at the moment, David. And this, again, feeds into Roland and James's story about Russia messing around on the fringes and then trying to find weaknesses in Western systems and undermine their diplomacy, etc. So Russia's been trying to get hold of a warm water port on the Red Sea for some time, for 5 or 6 years. They thought they had a deal in about 6 years ago, but the guy they started the deal with was overthrown, etc. They thought they had a deal a couple of years ago. This seems to have been undermined. But now a senior leader of the military junta which runs Sudan said in an Arabic interview about 9 days ago that they were going to offer Russia use as something akin to a base, but not quite a base, is what he said, Port Sudan on the Red Sea in exchange for weapons. And now today, actually, the deputy leader of Sudan, of this military junta, which is fighting a civil war in Sudan, is in St. Petersburg at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum. He's expected to meet Putin. So I would definitely watch his space because I think there may be an announcement about a Russian base on the Red Sea. Russia wants this base on the Red Sea badly because it's a way of projecting more influence both into Africa and across the Red Sea, where nearly a third of the world's shipping containers pass through up to the Suez Canal. And it also gives them potentially more influence into the Indian Ocean. Panning out slightly, but keeping a focus on Africa, Sergei Lavrov is at the moment today in Guinea, expected to meet the president there, again spreading Russian influence. Yunusbek Yakurov, the deputy defense minister, was in Libya at the weekend, talking to the leader of the Eastern forces, again spreading Russian influence. We know that Russia's been encouraging migration routes to Europe through war-torn Libya. They've been funneling weapons to this, the Eastern forces, they're called, sort of anti-Western alliance forces, keeping that civil war going, etc. So there's an awful lot going on in Africa. African leaders are regulars at Vladimir Putin's set-piece May the 9th parades. Russia really thinks it's got an in Africa. They've been blamed by the West for encouraging several coups across sub-Saharan Africa. So the Kremlin clearly thinks they found a weakness there and they're going to push it.
Well, thank you so much, James. Can we zoom out from Africa and go to your beat, Central Asia, and talk just a little bit about President Mirziyoyev, who I know you wanted to mention, because again, this is part of the Kremlin's sort of geopolitical movement in the region. What struck you about his meeting with Putin?
I try and regularly talk about Central Asia and the South Caucasus on this podcast, not just because it's a personal interest of mine, but should also be high on the agenda for people really focusing in on the war in Ukraine, because I think it's a very good way of gauging where Russia sits in the pantheon of its diplomatic reach. What they are doing in Central Asia and South Caucasus and the amount of influence they're able to project reflects how they are getting on the battlefield and how Putin himself feels things are going. So his body language, and I mean, looking at his body language and what he says and how he's received in Central Asia, former Soviet Central Asia, which Moscow very much regards as its backyard. I've been looking at it very closely for a couple of years since the full-scale invasion. Putin dropped in for a massive state visit in Tashkent in Uzbekistan at the beginning of last week. This was his first trip to Central Asia since November last year, but his third overseas trip after Belarus and China since he won that presidential election in mid-March. He is traveling more. This is an important point. He's feeling confident. He's going to these places, and he was received like a conquering emperor by Shavkat Mirziyoyev, the president of Uzbekistan. He got the full red carpet treatment. He was there for about 2 nights, which is quite a long time for Putin. He was, shown various museum pieces. There was a big signing ceremony. Putin put a signature for Rosatom, the Russian nuclear agency, to build Uzbekistan's first nuclear power station. Now, this contrasts very, very strongly with the way that David Cameron was received in Central Asia, and particularly in Uzbekistan when he did his trip out there at the end of April. Central Asia has been an area where the West thought that they could leverage more influence after the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It did unnerve Central Asian countries to a degree, and Putin's getting quite not frosty, but less friendly than you would have expected reception when he travelled there in 22 and even 23. But since his forces have been on the front foot in Ukraine, and since he's projected more confidence and calm, is rowed back. So this sort of reception that he got in Uzbekistan, I don't think he would have got it this time last year. This is a big thing. When Cameron came to Tashkent, he didn't even get a cup of tea with Mirziyoyev. Yeah, Mirziyoyev was too busy to meet him, so he had to make do with the foreign minister. He did meet leaders in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, but he didn't meet Mirziyoyev. And yet here is Mirziyoyev literally rolling out the red carpet for Putin in a very sort of exuberant way.
Thank you so much, Roland, James, and James. Before our final thoughts, though, let's go to our Asia correspondent, Nicola Smith, who is in Singapore, covering the Asian Security Summit, the Shangri-la Dialogue. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelelnksy made a surprise appearance at the conference. He also made news. We asked Nicola to send us her take on what she heard.
This weekend I was at the Shangri-la Dialogue, which is Asia's top security summit, and it's held in the luxury Shangri-la Hotel in Singapore. It gathers defence ministers, top security officials from across Asia, the United States, Europe, Australia, as well as experts from think tanks and journalists and diplomats. And it holds panel debates in the ballroom about Indo-Pacific security, looking at hotspots like Taiwan, the South China Sea, Myanmar. But often the most interesting business is actually done in side meetings in the hotel's rooms and suites. And the annual forum has really become known as a temperature gauge of the US-China relationship and competition. And this year, Lloyd Austin, the US Defense Secretary, met for the first time with Dong Jun, the Chinese Defense Minister. And they had a cordial chat, although there was really little shift in their entrenched positions over major points of contention, especially the future of Taiwan. The dialogue is an opportunity for American and Chinese defence chiefs, as well as Indo-Pacific leaders, to set out their stances on what could become future flashpoints in the region. And I think few at the conference this year would have left feeling reassured that tensions are cooling. And it was against this backdrop on Friday evening that rumours started flying around that Zelensky was also coming to give a speech. And he has addressed the conference virtually before, but never in person. Many in Asia, particularly East Asia, have linked the Ukraine crisis with the Indo-Pacific's future, fearing that a victory for Putin could embolden China to push forward on its own territorial claims, particularly over Taiwan. There's a lot of nervousness in Asia about the idea of a large, powerful nation simply being able to invade a smaller one with impunity. And in 2022, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida warned at this very same Shangri-La Dialogue that Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. So there's a lot of support for Zelensky in Asia, and his surprise visit was finally confirmed on Saturday, which immediately sparked a buzz of excitement in the hotel. And he arrived just after 5 p.m. in the afternoon to an extremely crowded hotel lobby with people lining up with their phones and straining to catch a glimpse of him from the lobby floor or from balconies above. And it was all extremely last minute. He didn't go to the prestigious dinner at the National Gallery of Singapore that the other government officials went to. That was possibly because of security. Although one of his bodyguards was actually spotted on Saturday evening with a large bag of kebabs, so I'm sure he didn't go hungry. But throughout the course of his visit, he had several bilateral meetings with the leaders of Singapore, Timor-Leste, Indonesia, and also with Lloyd Austin. But crucially not with the Chinese. Under the Chinese system, Dong Jun doesn't have the same influence or decision-making powers as Lloyd Austin would, but it could still be viewed as a snub that he didn't meet Zelensky, particularly in light of the close ties between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. Putin was greeted by Xi in Beijing in May as an old friend, and his visit at the time underscored rapidly expanding military cooperation between the two allies, and that has really alarmed Western capitals. The two leaders have been very keen to build their no limits partnership to reshape the US-led global order. China has refused to condemn the Ukraine war, and it backs Moscow diplomatically, accusing the West of undermining Russia's security. In fact, after Lloyd Austin's speech on Saturday, a Chinese colonel piped up to openly challenge him that the war had been caused by NATO's expansion. Putin has spoken favourably of China's plan for peace in Ukraine, and this is referring to a vague 12-point plan that would apparently cement Moscow's control of the Ukrainian regions it's captured through military force. And this growing Russia-China collaboration has to be very uncomfortable for Zelensky, and he really needs Asia's backing. So his visit to Singapore was focused on drumming up attendance at the Global Peace Summit, due to be hosted in Switzerland in mid-June. And he used his speech to the plenary as well as private meetings to appeal to leaders to come to Switzerland and to support a diplomatic path that would bring a just end to the war. He said the summit was going to focus on nuclear security, food security, and the release of prisoners of war and children abducted by Russia. And he was really urging people to attend. Zelensky's speech was given a very long round of applause, but it's still not clear how many Asian nations will attend in Switzerland. He said that over 100 countries have signed up already, but that he was disappointed that some world leaders have not yet confirmed their participation. And that does include US President Joe Biden so far, although the US has committed to send a high-level official. But China is not sending anybody, and it has publicly criticised the peace initiative because Russia is not invited. Zelensky held a press conference after his speech, and it was here that he had some very strong and quite unprecedented public criticism for Beijing. He accused China of being, quote, an instrument in the hands of Putin, claiming that the country was not only snubbing the peace summit, but was also dispatching its own diplomats at Russia's behest to persuade other countries to avoid the summit. He also echoed the US accusation that China has been providing military support to Russia, which Beijing denies. Washington has alleged that China's export of dual-use goods to Moscow is bolstering its defence industrial base. And Mr. Zelensky accused Beijing of undermining its pledges not to arm Russia, saying that today there are various signals from various intelligence services that somehow, some way, something comes to Russia's markets via China. Overall, Zelensky's message was a real rebuke to Beijing. He said that with China's support to Russia, the war will last longer. He said that this is bad for the whole world and for the policy of China, which declares that it supports territorial integrity and sovereignty. China, for its part, claims neutrality in the conflict, but it also provides an economic lifeline to Russia, which is subject to international sanctions because of the invasion. In a speech to the Defence Conference on Sunday morning, Dong Jun said that China had been promoting peace talks with a responsible attitude. However, since a phone call between Zelensky and the Chinese President Xi Jinping 1 year ago, Ukraine has sought out meetings with Chinese officials at all levels, and these have not been granted, and they were not granted once more at the Shangri-la Dialogue. So it does appear that China is saying one thing and doing another.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Coming up, we hear Roland, James and James's final thoughts. James Rothwell, can we come to you first in Berlin?
Yes, I think I'll end my final thoughts, David, with the view that escalation has very much come back into the public debate on this, and we can go very briefly back to Germany. As I was supposed to point out earlier, actually, that Mr. Scholz has said he does not think it would be an escalation, this decision that he's taken to allow the use of German weapons inside Russian territory. And I think my view on this, or at least my sort of observation on this really, is that Mr. Scholz doesn't really lose anything by saying that this is not an escalation. because as we've discussed previously, we're talking about German weapons that aren't really relevant to, as I understand it, not really relevant to the Battle of Kharkiv anyway. So he probably feels he can say this and get away with it without angering the Russian leadership too much, which is a very, very big part of Olaf Scholz's foreign policy. And I would also end on this, really. I think, unfortunately, the elephant in the room in a discussion about Germany and escalation is, of course, the Taurus missiles. It just looks so unlikely that they're ever going to be sent. And for many supporters of Ukraine out there, that is a great shame, because there's a lot of skepticism about the extent to which they would escalate the war, and they would have a sort of kinetic force in use on the battlefield. But sadly, for those who want to see Taurus missiles being delivered, it just doesn't look like it's going to happen.
Thank you very much, James Rothwell, calling in from Berlin. Roland, can I come to you next? Roland Oliphant.
Hello. I wanted to echo things that both of the others said, actually. What James Kilner was saying about, the reception Putin got in Uzbekistan. I mean, in my conversation, he's absolutely spot on, is what I'm saying. I agree with James's analysis, because in my conversations with people from that part of the world, Central Asia, the South Caucasus, kind of Russia's near abroad, it's very, very clear. Like, people will say things like, we wouldn't be doing X if, for example, Russia was not doing as well as it is on the battlefield at the moment. Or previously, something else might have happened and they'd have said, well, Russia isn't doing that well. Like, for them, it's existential. If Russia's going to win, they cannot afford to be anything other than in Russia's good books, kind of thing. So they are all watching this war like a hawk, and you will see their kind of their policies, their openings, their diplomacy adjusted as the war swings one way or another. So just to add, like, absolutely spot on. I completely agree with James's analysis there. That is almost like a kind of, a bell jar, a barometer or something, a kind of indicator of perceptions, at least perceptions of where the war is going, and so on. And on the escalation point, that was the other thing that I was kind of chewing over. There's a chap called Samuel Charap, who's an American political scientist. He gets a lot of stick because he's got a reputation for being very skeptical about Ukraine and a kind of, is there any point in supplying weapons and so on and so forth. I'd let him speak for himself. But anyway, he wrote a piece for the Washington Post about this question. And there's something in there which I think is a legitimate point. And you could take it from a kind of, if you're a skeptic who wants, if you think victory is impossible, you could read it that way if you wanted. But even, you might be a hawk and read it the other way. And his point was this. It was like, okay, so they've moved the red line. They've supplied the weapons. But look, it's not going to really change the course of the war in the way that I outlined earlier. B, it's reactive. It's not something that European governments or the White House plan to do. They're responding to a crisis. Again, they're reacting. They're not defining things. And C, it seems to be absent an overarching strategy for ending the war. Now, Sam Charap, again, we should let him speak for himself, actually. And maybe it's even worth having him on at some point. I don't know. I mean, gets up people's noses. But these are arguments you have to engage with. He talks a lot about, there's going to be talks. Maybe we should have talks sooner rather than later, so on and so forth. Even if you don't believe that, the absence of at least a publicly declared kind of strategy for winning the war has been noticeable all the way through. I'm talking about Western governments, not from the Ukrainian government, but from Western governments. And you do have alternatives out there, like the Estonians. The Estonian Defense Ministry published a paper, outlining a strategy for the West winning a war of attrition in Ukraine in December. But that very much looks like kind of lobbying to get someone's ear. We've never really seen, or I feel like we've never really seen, a clearly defined kind of, okay, this is the plan, this is how we're going to get to a victory or a settlement or something else. Part of that will be because it doesn't make sense to publish your strategy, but one does begin to wonder whether or not, any such strategy even exists. I'm surprised I'm saying that 2.5 years into the war, but it remains a big question hanging over everything. We know the Russian strategy for victory is pretty much, it's not difficult to work out. What is the collective West's? Who knows?
Thank you, James Rothwell. Thank you, Roland Oliphant. James Kilner, would you like to finish this episode?
Thank you, David. So really just to alert listeners about this creeping or the invasive Russian influence it's having on its so-called near abroad Georgian Dream, the sort of parliamentary governing party down in Georgia, is introducing a bill today to ban LGBT propaganda. This is straight out of the Kremlin's playbook. It's going to, it's really tapping into those family values, etc. The Kremlin wants to push. This follows last week's adoption of the Foreign Agents Bill, which will require NGOs which get 20% of their income from overseas to register with the government units, and critics have said that this is sort of being imposed to clamp down on them, basically, and is the same as a 2012 bill that was introduced in Russia. So this is just another example of the influence. Georgia was naturally, or has been naturally, a westward-looking country on an EU trajectory. It was offered candidate status in December, and is run by but the Kremlin-linked billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili, who bankrolls the Georgian Dream party, has stepped in, and he's clearly trying to pull Georgia away from its EU trajectory. So that's just another sort of Russian influence issue for your listeners to keep in mind. There was a story at the weekend which I couldn't quite pin down, although it's been widely reported in Russian language media, that Saudi Arabia has pulled out of the Swiss peace talks later this month. That would be a massive blow to Zelensky, I think. I didn't report it in the end because I couldn't source it sufficiently, and I wasn't comfortable with sourcing, but it has been reported everywhere. I also want to alert readers about that, your listeners about that. We have seen it. We haven't fully reported it, but it's something they can also investigate at their own will.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear.